Morning. This is Mr. Gossler bringing you your lesson for today, April the 15th. Today we're going to be continuing our discussion on the Cold War, specifically how it will intensify in the 1950s. So by the time we get to 1950, 5 years after the end of World War II, the Soviet Union and the United States have emerged as the two dominant superpowers of the world. And they are already well embroiled in a struggle, an ideological struggle between democratic capitalist societies under the United States and communist dictatorships under the Soviet Union. The conflicting ideologies, particularly between capitalism and communism, would lead to what would next become called the arms race, in which both of these nations sought to establish military superiority over one another, as well as influence over other regions of the world. Now, prior to today, most of what we've discussed so far in the Cold War was the United States kind of pushing its weight around against the Soviet Union, particularly because they had a piece of technology that the Soviet Union did not have called an atomic bomb. However, as early as September of 1949, there were instances of tests being done somewhere outside of the United States, and very quickly it became apparent that the Soviet Union had successfully tested their own form of an atomic weapon. This would become what most people refer to as the beginning of the nuclear arms race portion of the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. What I mean by this is they're not going to be physically using bombs on anybody, atomic bombs, but instead building up a nuclear arsenal to see who had the most nuclear weapons, creating much tension, as well as fears amongst the public, not just in the United States and the Soviet Union, but all over the globe, that a nuclear conflict could break out. Through and through, the United States was very much unprepared for the Soviet Union's development of an atomic bomb. We're not going to talk about it too much in this lesson, but they may have had some help. And that help came, unfortunately, from Americans that had worked on the Manhattan Project, is what we know today. And when they come to discover, the U.S. government came to discover that they no longer had a monopoly on nuclear weapons, their next reaction was, hey, well, what if we just build more nuclear weapons than the Soviet Union has, in response to them now having the ability to create nuclear bombs? And then the counter response to that is the Soviet Union sees us escalating our production of nuclear weapons, and then they do the same. Now, it wasn't just a fear of the Soviet Union being the only ones having those weapons, though, as there was a successful communist revolution in China, and the Chinese a lot of times were receiving resources from the Soviet Union. So American leaders weren't just fearful of a nation like the Soviet Union getting their hands on atomic bombs, but also all communist nations, as this could truly throw the power kind of shift over in the hands of the Soviets if they were to start sharing their understanding of nuclear technology with their allies. As a result, in 1950, President Truman would initiate publicly the development of a more powerful bomb. This would become known as the H-bomb, or the hydrogen bomb, and it was predicted that it would be much, much more powerful than the atomic bombs that were used on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Again, this would warrant a response, as it was pretty public that Truman was pushing for this, and the Soviet Union would also start trying to develop a hydrogen bomb before the United States would be able to. Now, this escalating nuclear arms race, it put a lot of fear into a lot of people, especially those scientists that had helped to develop these first nuclear bombs. Robert Oppenheimer, as well as Albert Einstein, expressed their concerns about this escalating arms race to the president, but also to the world, bringing about the idea that the consequences could be dire, not just for these two nations, but for all nations if nuclear war were to break out. But in the next 2 years, the United States would focus on building up its nuclear arsenal as well as developing a hydrogen bomb. And in 1952, the United States would test the world's first hydrogen bomb following the Soviet Union's test. It was called the Mike and Bravo tests, and they were much, much larger, as you can see from these comparison to the Hiroshima bombing as well as the Trinity tests. But within the next year, the Soviet Union would actually test one of their own hydrogen bombs, and the effects of this particular bomb, which we today call Tsar Bomba, was very much fear-inducing. This bomb was absolutely massive, and it had the capability to destroy not just cities, but entire states or nations. Again, just further escalating those tensions and those fears on both sides. And as a result, both of these nations would continue to rapidly develop and stockpile nuclear weapons, as well as devices to actually use them, such as airplanes that could carry larger nuclear weapons or hydrogen weapons, as well as submarines. And later on, they would start the development of what are called intercontinental ballistic missiles, which would give them the ability to fire nuclear weapons from their own borders into other nations as well. This brought about a new Cold War policy, which was widely accepted on both sides, called MAD for short, or Mutually Assured Destruction, which was just the idea that if one side were to use a nuclear weapon on the other, that they would retaliate with their entire nuclear arsenal, leading not just to the total annihilation of that nation or both nations, but possibly the entire world. So obviously, this is not a true solution. Even though this would deter or stop these nations from maybe going all out in a nuclear war, it left the rest of the global community under constant and persistent fear that a nuclear conflict between these two nations could result in the end of the human race as we know it. So what I'm going to have you do now is I'm going to have you watch this video that goes a little bit more in depth into what mutually assured destruction is and how this Cold War policy would determine the future of Cold War policies in general for the next about decade or two.